Hello my dears, welcome back to another video. Listen, I know I've been gone for a cheeky minute, okay, but listen, you're not listening. Listen, my time off has not been in vain, okay? I have been working on some content for you guys that I really hope that you are going to enjoy. Cheers to 2024. We made it, guys. The world didn't burn. World War III still hasn't happened yet. I would call that success. But anyways, in today's video, I want to talk about representation, and I want to pose the question, do people actually care about representation and inclusivity? Or rather, do people care about these things as much as we're told we're supposed to care about them? The reason I ask is because I feel like a lot of our actions contradict a lot of the things that we hear being said in the mainstream when people talk about representation. So there were reports that Victoria's Secret was bringing sexy back, and it was abandoning what some dubbed its feminist rebranding. The brand had taken on a more inclusive path by adding disabled women, plus-size women, more masculine presenting women, and trans models. Victoria's Secret also decided to introduce a more inclusive runway show, as they decided to scrap their iconic Victoria's Secret Angels catwalk, which usually featured women who had a very particular idealized aesthetic. Unfortunately for Victoria's Secret, after the rebrand, they did take a hit in their sales and they weren't making as much profit as they were before the rebrand. Now, what's really interesting is that Americans are the biggest consumers of Victoria's Secret products. And according to the CDC, this is what the average American woman's measurements are, which means that she would look roughly something like this. So this means that the average American woman would probably have looked more like the rebrand, as the Victoria's Secret rebrand did include more plus-size models. So it's quite interesting to me that despite the fact that the American woman doesn't look like the original Victoria's Secret model, that the brand would take a hit when they start representing more women who look a bit more like the average American woman. Another example that comes to mind when I think of representation not giving people the desired outcomes is the Marvels movie. All of the main characters were females of different ethnicities and backgrounds, which was supposed to be an opportunity to offer more representation for different types of women. I've heard people say that this was apparently deliberately done to try and capture more of a female audience, especially because it was a switch up from the superheroes that we were used to having, who were all predominantly male and white. So they decided to make the cast female and of different ethnicities to try and, be more representative of other Marvel fans who may not look like the original cast. But what was really interesting about this is that women didn't really seem to be all that interested in watching the Marvels. In fact, there were even some articles that were calling this out, with some of them with titles like "Women Fail to Show Up to Support the Marvels" or something like that. As if you have an obligation to go and watch a film just because you're a woman and the people starring in it are women. We've been here before, guys, okay? It didn't work with women's sport. It's not going to work with this either. But in the case of the Marvels, I don't even think it's the case that women aren't interested in female superheroes or that women don't want to watch female superheroes. Women want to watch well-written female superheroes. Keywords being well written. So the Marvels unfortunately was not a success. In fact, I think it was one of their worst performing movies since the franchise began. So again, it kind of leads us back to the question of, well, is representation and inclusion as important to people as we keep hearing it is? Because if it is, then why do these rebrands that try to be more inclusive and more representative keep flopping? I've gone back and forth at this point on whether or not I think representation actually does or doesn't matter. And the underwhelming conclusion I have reached is that it depends. I've come to accept that it's not really as black and white as we would like to think it is. And I've noticed that even people who appear to have a very solid stance on representation in either direction also seem to have some level of cognitive dissonance. For example, I've seen people who argue that representation doesn't matter, simultaneously argue that hip hop culture and rap music is negatively impacting black youth. And I've also seen this same camp argue that hypersexual female influencers or female musicians are negatively impacting or negatively influencing young girls. So surely if they can recognize that negative representation can have a negative impact on people, then that would mean that positive representation can also have a positive impact on people too. And then in the opposite camp, you have the people who argue that representation absolutely matters, which is why it's important for women to see themselves as CEOs and for ethnic minorities to see themselves in leading roles, because they argue that making it possible for them to see these things allows them to see what's possible and what kind of things they can aspire to. But yet they'll simultaneously argue that placing obese women on the cover of magazines and putting titles like "This is Healthy" isn't celebrating obesity or trying to normalize it, and isn't going to make people think that it's aspirational. Even those who appear to have a very blanket view on representation in either direction, at least on a subconscious level, acknowledge that it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit less black and white than just simply saying, yes, it does matter, or no, it doesn't. And this can also be demonstrated by the fact that being more inclusive and representative doesn't always necessarily lead to failure. There are other brands that have been inclusive and representative that have had a lot of success. I would say that one example is Rihanna's brand Fenty. Fenty has been always very inclusive from the very beginning, and I would go as far as to say that Rihanna actually really helped the makeup industry innovate. There have been also other female fashion brands that have been very inclusive. They have different types of women. They showcase pregnant women, tall women, short women, plus size women, all sorts of women of different skin tones and shades. And these brands have also had a lot of success with their inclusive marketing. They haven't experienced the same sales decline in the same way that Victoria's Secret did. So what was it that these other fashion brands did that Victoria's Secret didn't do? Why was their inclusive and representative marketing such a success for them, but a complete failure for Victoria's Secret? I personally think that one of the problems is that we are currently living in a time where some people were playing linguistic games. And by that, I mean that people are using words, but the words that they're using often mean the opposite of what they're actually doing. Often what we're seeing with a lot of these brands, and this is the case for Victoria's Secret, is that they will take things away and replace them with something completely different and call that inclusivity, when really that's just replacement. The difference between these other fashion brands and Victoria's Secret is that they didn't get rid of their original models. They kept their original models, they just expanded their catalogue in terms of what kinds of women they were featuring. Whereas Victoria's Secret scrapped the angels and replaced them with all these other models. That's not inclusivity, that's replacement. You're still being discriminatory, it's just you're now changing the direction in which you're discriminating against. I also think another thing that plays a big role in this is the energy that the rebrand comes with. Fenty never felt like a grievance project. You know, it felt as though Rihanna was in that office and she was like, listen, I want to make a brand that everybody can use. And so she worked with her team to try and make sure that everybody could use her brand, whether you were the fairest of them all or whether you had a deep melanin-rich complexion. She wanted to make sure that you could use her product. So it never felt like a grievance project. It actually felt inclusive. It didn't feel as though she went into the industry with a chip on her shoulder, and this idea that because darker skinned people had been neglected by the makeup industry for all these years, she was just going to create a brand that only dark skinned girls can use and screw the fair-skinned girls. Instead, she was like, no, I'm actually going to be genuinely inclusive and make sure that everybody can use my brand. And as a result, her brand was a booming success and everybody could use it, and now she's a billionaire. Whereas Victoria's Secret's rebrand felt like a grievance project. They kicked out all those skinny legends and they were like, we're gonna have all these different types of women who we feel like would have been rejected by the fashion industry before, and we're going to put them on there. We're going to, rebrand and recreate what's beautiful, etc., etc. So it felt like a grievance project, and I don't think people really enjoy those kind of rebrands. It feels more like a statement, it feels more like a bit of a lecture than just simply trying to make the point that different types of women can be beautiful, if that makes sense, right? Or different types of women can look good in this lingerie and be sexy and feel sexy, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And this is something that I've said before, but whenever you do a rebrand or you change something up about your brand or whatever, you always run the risk of alienating your core fan base because, people just don't like abrupt change. I don't know what to tell you. Human beings are indeed sentimental. Not only that, but people just don't like feeling lectured to. So even if they support the message, just because it felt like a lecture, they're more inclined to reject it. I've also seen some people speculate maybe the reason why the rebrand wasn't very successful is because not only did Victoria's Secret sell lingerie, but they also sold a fantasy.
When you want to buy something from a lingerie store, you want it to look good and you want the, let's face it, best body there is.
Yeah, and it is by definition an aspirational purchase. I mean, let's face it, a lot of it will be bought by the men of the women who will end up wearing it. and probably getting the size wrong, and marriages break up over this all the time, I'm told. I think my husband's ever been brave enough to do that. But this is the thing. Women want to imagine that's what they look like. Their other halves would like to imagine that's what they look like. I mean, and again, we're told, well, women, no, not all women look like this. No, but we all in our heads think that we're maybe just one summer diet away from having, legs all the way up to our shoulders and, and looking this way. These are aspirational images, and that's what we like to see.
And I don't think this theory is too far-fetched because, there are a lot of things that we buy because of how good they look on the model. And even the clothing brands that I mentioned before that have seen a lot of success with their inclusive models still kind of show an idealistic version of these women. So for example, when you look at their plus size section, the plus size models that they feature still fall within this idealistic version of plus size women. When you look at things like their waist to hip ratio, they still sport a very curvaceous hourglass figure. They also don't have any visible roles or anything like that, so they still are an idealistic version of plus size women. So I can see the validity in this theory that maybe the reason why Victoria's Secret took a hit is because they were no longer selling the fantasy and women don't aspire necessarily to look like the rebrand models. I do think that's maybe one of the components though. I don't think that's necessarily the entire story as to why this rebrand wasn't successful, but I can see why people think that. And articles like this one from The Guardian explain why the rebrand also didn't connect with its targeted audience. Many of those who already didn't like the brand weren't persuaded to become new customers by the rebrand because they thought it was performative and, quite frankly, too little too late. But when it comes to inclusivity and representation, I do think that sometimes we use words like diversity, representation, and inclusivity interchangeably. I know that I'm definitely guilty of doing this. And I think that was something that I came to realize about myself as well when it came to Hollywood and why I had such a big issue with the stuff that they were doing with like their race swaps and their gender swaps, etc. I realized that what I actually cared more about was diversity. And no, I don't mean diversity in the sense of having the exact same human beings that just come in different packaging. I mean like diversity of stories, diversity of perspectives, diversity of different character types and all that kind of stuff. Because I think that ultimately, if you focus on telling a lot of new diverse stories, you will inherently end up being more inclusive as you search for new stories to tell. As you search for new stories to tell, it will take you to other parts of the world where you'll discover different mythologies and different histories, etc. And so in doing that, you will inherently end up becoming a lot more representative and a lot more inclusive. I guess my main issue with Hollywood is I just don't like the idea of doing representation for the sake of representation. The idea of doing race swaps and gender swaps was just irritating because it very much felt like representation for the sake of representation. And when I asked you guys a couple of months ago whether or not you cared about representation, these were the results. I split the poll between men and women because I keep seeing different variations of this meme and I wanted to know if it was true. And these were the top comments, which I feel echoed my sentiments as well when it came to the issues with representation and how it's being handled by Hollywood. And I think that really is the main problem that people have when it comes to representation nowadays, is it just feels as though it's being done to tick a box. And I also started to realize the problem with teaching young kids that in order for them to be able to relate to a character, that character has to look like them. Because that is definitely an idea that is put into the minds of children, because children don't think like that. If it wasn't obvious already, as a kid, my favorite Disney princess was Ariel. I used to watch the Little Mermaid cartoon series on Disney, and I watched her film, the first and the second one, multiple times as a child. Now, Ariel is a white girl with fire truck red hair, and I don't know if you can tell, but I am not. Despite the popular misconceptions about Ariel, her story is deeper than just giving up her voice to be with a man. Ariel was someone who was always fascinated by the human world, which is why she collected all of those different items that she'd found from the boats, and why she literally has an entire song singing about how she wants to be a part of that world. All of this happened way before she even knew who Eric was. But what stood out to me the most about Ariel's story is how there was a conflict between what she wanted for herself and what her father wanted for her, and that's what I related to. For me, growing up, like many other kids who come from similar backgrounds, whether that's African or Asian, your parents place a lot of high expectations for you in terms of what they want you to be, and they have an idea of what kind of jobs they want you to do, and often they're along the lines of doctor or a lawyer or something within that realm.
Like in an African family, there's only a few choices of career: doctor, lawyer, engineer, disgrace to the family. Those are the choices. Those are the choices.
From a young age, I've always been very creative. I love to write songs, I love to draw, and then when I went to uni, I discovered that I love to make videos. And so I've always known that I wanted to go and do something that was more in that field. That was not something that excited my parents. When you tell your parents you want to do something that they don't have any personal experience with, like they don't know anyone who's done it, you're going into this field that's uncertain. It can be a little bit concerning because they want what's best for you. They want to make sure you can eat. They want to make sure that you can feed yourself and pay your bills, etc. And so when you say you want to do something unconventional, it's naturally a little bit, worrying for them. Initially, they became super supportive before I started YouTube, which was great, and they have become like my biggest cheerleaders ever. So growing up, I kind of struggled a lot with internal conflicts of wanting to pursue something that was actually interesting to me and something that I really wanted to do and live a life that was more authentic to what I want for myself, versus going down the conventional route that your parents want you to go down because you don't want to disappoint them, and you love your parents, right? You don't want to disappoint them. But the point is, when I watched Ariel, I could understand her. I could relate to her. I could understand that feeling as though you're being pulled in one direction, but at the same time, you're scared to go towards it because you don't want to disappoint your parents, because your parents aren't super keen on you doing it because they're just trying to protect you. And, they want what's best for you, and their version of what's best for you doesn't align with your version of what's best for you. And so there's that internal conflict of making yourself happy and at the expense of potentially disappointing your parents, or making your parents happy at the expense of disappointing yourself. And so for that reason, I found Ariel's story to be more familiar and more relatable to me. It never once crossed my mind that she didn't look like me. And that's the beautiful innocence about a child's mind. They just don't think like that. In fact, let me put something really wholesome on your screen right now so you can see for yourself just how little children think or even notice identity, at least before their minds become polluted by adults.
What makes you two different from each other?
I used to not like letters, but now I like letters. I do not like letters at all. Lucy loved tomato sauce, and I do like it, but I don't love it as much as Lucy. Don't have the same. Our Arthur lives down the hill, and I live up the hill. No, I have smaller toes than Artie. Addie, I like goose and chips, and I like sushi. And they're different. She never stops talking.
Children notice differences. They're not stupid, but the point is they don't interpret it in the same way that adults do, which is why I'm so sure that these are ideas that we're putting into the minds of children. The idea that you have to have a princess look like you in order for you to relate to that princess. And so I do think that to teach young kids that in order for them to be able to relate to a character, the character has to look like them is incredibly limiting, because there is so much more to you as a person than what you look like or what the color of your skin is. And so if you can only ever relate to people who are the same race as you or the same gender as you, then that does limit your options. If you have the mindset that you have to see people who look like you doing something in order for you to be able to do it too, then you are going to limit yourself. Sometimes you just have to be the first. That being said, I don't believe that representation is completely pointless, because there are definitely times where it serves a much bigger purpose than just simply allowing people to see themselves. So often I see some people say things like representation or inclusivity is narcissistic, because they feel as though you having the desire to see yourself or see someone who looks like you is just a form of narcissism. And while I can understand that in some contexts that this viewpoint makes sense, I do think that representation and inclusivity is a bit more nuanced than just simply pedestalizing it or completely dismissing it. So like I mentioned before with the Fenty example, there were plenty of women before Rihanna's Fenty who couldn't use foundation because they didn't have their shade. It was about access, having equal access to products, having equal access to things. And is it so wrong for those people to have models who look like them so that they can see how these products would look on their skin tone? That also falls under representation and inclusion. Having models that look more like you so you can see how these colors and how these makeup products would look on your skin tone. Well, there's nothing narcissistic, in my opinion, about seeing how a product would look on you, and there's nothing narcissistic about having companies also include you in their product range so that you can also have equal access to these products. There are also other areas in which representation absolutely does matter that are completely not narcissistic, such as healthcare. There are certain skin conditions and skin cancers, etc., that look very differently depending on the type of skin you have. So one skin condition could look very different on someone with fairer skin versus how it would look on someone with darker skin. And I would argue that in this case, representation would absolutely be important so that people are able to see what these conditions would look like on their skin type, so that they are more likely to detect a problem and go and get help from a doctor. If you don't know what these things would look like on your skin, because every time you search them up on Google Images, it comes up with someone who doesn't look like you, and so this condition on their skin doesn't look anything like it would look like on yours, that could have a catastrophic effect on someone's health if they don't know what they're supposed to be looking out for and don't know when to go and get help. Would you consider that representation to also be narcissistic? And again, this is why I don't think you can make blanket statements about representation. So I guess we're back to my original question of, does representation and inclusivity actually matter? And well, my answer is still consistent. It depends. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It really does depend on the context. I don't really see a lot of people who actually say they don't like the idea of more things being added. Often what people dislike about inclusive things or inclusivity is that it's often replacement masquerading as inclusivity. And so I think a lot of the time when people are pushing back on quote inclusivity, they're often just pushing back on replacement. And I think a lot of the time when people push back on representation, it's not necessarily the fact that they dislike having diverse casts or different types of people on their screens, but it's more so the fact that it often feels quite forced, especially when it comes to Hollywood and TV shows. Often these people are just being added in just to kind of say, oh look, we have a diverse crew, etc. So I guess that would be my overall answer on whether or not I think people actually care about representation and inclusivity and whether or not it actually matters. Sometimes people do, sometimes people don't, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on what we're talking about and when we're talking about it. I think often people are very receptive to it and very open to it, provided it's not done in a lazy way, or provided it's not done in a very lectury way, or done in a way that feels like it's just ticking boxes or trying to make a point and make a statement. It needs to be done in a way that makes sense, in a way that adds value, and if it doesn't add value, then it's not really going to be received very well. And unfortunately, having a diverse or representative or inclusive cast in a show, for example, doesn't take away from the terrible writing. But that is really all for this video. I just thought I'd kind of share my thoughts on that and just kind of hear your feedback on what you think. So do let me know. I would be very interested to know why you think these rebrands have not been successful. If you have any theories on why they may have flopped, do let me know in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, you may as well like and subscribe. I really, really appreciate you giving me your time today, and I will see you in my next video.